It was a peculiar evening in London, the sort that seems to linger in the memory long after its passing, though at the moment it presents itself with only the faintest stirrings of foreboding. The gas lamps of Baker Street flickered in the autumnal fog, casting trembling halos across the cobbled streets, and the air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, damp earth, and something indefinably acrid. I had just returned from a routine medical call in the West End, and as I mounted the familiar stairs to 221B, I could not have anticipated that the events of the following hours would lodge themselves so indelibly in my mind. Holmes was in his customary armchair, the small fire beside him crackling with a soft, sporadic hiss. He did not glance up as I entered. Instead, he tapped a long, tapering finger upon the edge of his violin case, which had been set carefully upon the hearth. The instrument, in Holmes' capable hands, often served less as a source of music than as a conduit for thought. "I have been expecting something unusual tonight, Watson," he said finally, without preamble. His voice, always precise, carried an almost tangible excitement. "Though the nature of it is as yet unclear, I can feel the undercurrent of disturbance in the city. There is an anomaly approaching." I set down my medical bag and removed my coat, accustomed to his cryptic pronouncements yet ever intrigued. Holmes' perception of London was almost preternatural. Where I saw only fog and gaslight, he discerned hidden currents of motive and consequence. "An anomaly, Holmes?" I inquired, trying to conceal my habitual deference. "You make it sound as though the Thames itself has begun to plot mischief." He allowed himself a brief, sardonic smile, though his eyes, those piercing blue-gray orbs, never wavered from their scrutiny of some invisible pattern. "Precisely, Watson. The Thames, the gas lamps, the hansom cabs, every element has its part to play. Tonight, we shall witness a peculiarity that will strain the mind, even by our standards." Before I could press for further elucidation, a sharp, insistent knock came at the door. The sound was urgent, almost desperate, and it carried a tension that set my nerves on edge. Mrs. Hudson, ever faithful and composed, opened the door to reveal a gentleman whose appearance suggested sudden distress. His clothes were finely made, though crumpled from haste, and his hat was clutched tightly in his trembling hands. "Mr. Holmes?" he gasped, his voice strained as though he had been running or fleeing from some unseen menace. "I have been told that you may be able to assist me." Holmes was immediately alert, rising from his chair with that peculiar fluid grace that marked his every movement. He extended a hand in greeting, though his eyes never left the man's face. "Pray, calm yourself, sir. We shall endeavor to offer whatever assistance is within our means. Will you sit, and tell us in full what troubles you?" The man did so, sinking into the chair opposite us with a heavy sigh. He introduced himself as Mr. Reginald Fairfax, a solicitor of some repute, though his manner betrayed a man who had recently encountered circumstances beyond the reach of law or reason. There was an undercurrent of fear in his posture, a tremor in his voice that suggested more than mere anxiety. It spoke of genuine dread. "It is my client," he began, swallowing hard as though each word required effort, "a Mr. Elias Harrow. He is, and not merely missing, in the ordinary sense, but vanished under conditions that the police cannot comprehend." His study was locked from the inside. His candle still burned upon the desk. There was no sign of struggle, no note, nothing to indicate the slightest intention of departure. I felt a chill run down my spine. A missing person is, of course, a common enough occurrence in London, yet the manner in which Mr. Harrow had disappeared suggested something far more intricate. Holmes, for his part, was silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed the details. "Locked from the inside," he murmured, almost to himself. "An enclosed room, a candle still burning, and no exit discernible. Intriguing. Watson, you will wish to attend carefully. We are in the presence of a classic closed-room enigma, though with elements that promise deviation from the ordinary." Mr. Fairfax continued, relating the sequence of events leading to his client's disappearance. He described Mr. Harrow as a scholar of some renown, known for his meticulous attention to detail and a certain eccentricity in his habits. He had spent the evening at his study, reviewing documents and illuminated manuscripts that were said to possess curious properties. When morning came, he was gone. The servants reported no unusual noises, no disturbance, and the doors were secured as always. Most perplexing of all, he left behind a peculiar object upon his desk. A small lantern of polished brass, which, according to the housekeeper, had never gone out despite its wick appearing spent. Holmes' gaze lingered upon my face, and I knew he had already begun to assemble the fragments of evidence into a pattern invisible to ordinary observers. I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the quiet exhilaration that accompanies the first brush with a case that promises complexity and subtlety. "Tell me, Mr. Fairfax," Holmes inquired, "was this lantern of any particular significance to Mr. Harrow?" "He claimed," Fairfax replied, hesitating as if uncertain how to phrase the words, "that it was a device of great personal importance. He spoke often of light and the preservation of knowledge, though I confess I never fully understood his meaning. It was said to have properties beyond ordinary comprehension. The servants themselves are uneasy, insisting that it burns without fuel, as though some occult force sustains it." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled. "A curious device indeed. Yet I warn you, Mr. Fairfax, that the supernatural seldom enters the realm of deduction. We must consider always the natural laws, however obscure their application may be." I could sense the tension in the room, a quiet pressure that seemed to emanate from the very walls of 221B, as though the fog outside had crept inside with our visitor. Holmes, in his characteristic fashion, appeared almost at ease, yet I knew him well enough to perceive the rapid calculations running through his mind. "Fear not, Mr. Fairfax," he said finally, rising from his chair and pacing slowly. "We shall investigate Mr. Harrow's disappearance with every tool at our disposal. I shall accompany you to his residence tonight, and we shall examine this lantern, as well as the study itself. I suspect that the solution will be less a matter of specters and more a test of logic and observation." The gravity in Holmes' tone reassured Fairfax, though the tremor in his hands persisted. As we prepared to depart, I could not help but reflect on the strange circumstances of the case. A missing scholar, a locked study, a lantern that refused to extinguish. London, in all its fog and bustle, had never seemed more mysterious, more pregnant with secrets waiting to be unveiled. As we stepped into the misty night, Holmes' eyes sparkled with that familiar, unsettling light of intellectual anticipation. He moved with the certainty of one who sees paths invisible to others, tracing patterns in the ether that I could barely perceive. And I, faithful chronicler, felt the familiar mixture of admiration and awe, tempered by a creeping apprehension, for I knew that we were embarking upon a journey that would test not only our wits but the very fabric of our understanding. The streets were quiet, save for the distant rattle of a hansom cab and the occasional call of a night watchman. Yet beneath the surface calm I sensed the undercurrent that Holmes had spoken of, a disturbance, subtle yet insistent, which would reveal itself in due course. Somewhere within the fog, London held its breath, and the lantern that never dimmed awaited our discovery. Little did I know that this case, this peculiar blend of intellect and enigma, would challenge every precept I held of deduction, morality, and the human heart. The game, as Holmes would no doubt remind me, was afootend in this instance. It promised to be unlike any we had encountered before. The night had deepened as we traversed the fog-laden streets toward Mr. Elias Harrow's residence, a narrow townhouse tucked away in the quieter reaches of Bloomsbury. The gas lamps flickered intermittently, their feeble glow barely penetrating the dense London mist. Holmes walked ahead with his customary swiftness, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile sharp and commanding against the pale light. I followed at a steadier pace, noting the nervous pallor of our solicitor companion, Mr. Fairfax, whose eyes darted continually toward the shadows. We arrived at the house, a modest structure of brick, though distinguished by a small brass plaque bearing the name E. Harrow, S.A., and Holmes immediately began his examination before even ringing the bell. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the threshold, the lock, and the hinges of the door with meticulous care. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "the faint scratches on the wood beneath the lock. Evidently someone attempted to manipulate it from outside, though their efforts were crude and superficial. There is no evidence of force sufficient to enter the house. Our intruder, if indeed there was one, was constrained by the same limitation as the missing man, enclosed space, and no exit apparent." I knelt beside him to inspect the marks more closely. They were shallow, almost negligible, yet Holmes' trained eye saw the subtle abrasions as though they were shouted from the surface itself. I could not help but marvel at his attention to detail. "So," I asked, "you are suggesting that someone tried to break in but failed?" Not exactly, Watson, he replied, straightening. It is equally possible that these scratches were made by Mr. Harrow himself or, even by the object upon which he worked. Note the directionality. The faint traces of something dragged or pressed repeatedly against the wood. We must keep all hypotheses open until further inspection. The front door opened at our knock, and we were greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Beecham, a stout woman whose hand shook ever so slightly as she held the lantern. Her expression bore the marks of sleepless nights and silent worry. "Mr. Harrow, sir, he's gone," she whispered, clutching the lantern tightly as if it were both shield and burden. "I canna explain it. The candle in his study, it never went out. Even when the wick burned to the end, it continued to glow. I cannot abide by it. It frightens me, sir." Holmes accepted the lantern with careful hands, inspecting its polished brass exterior, the subtle etching along its base, and the tiny wick that seemed utterly spent. "Fascinating," he murmured. "No ordinary lamp. Note the absence of soot accumulation around the glass. There is no sign of conventional combustion sustaining it. Yet the flame persists. We shall return to this presently." Mrs. Beecham led us to the study. The door was secured, just as Mr. Fairfax had described. Holmes produced a slender set of lockpicks, which he employed with the practiced precision of a surgeon, and within moments, the door yielded without sound or resistance. The room was exactly as Fairfax had described it. Shelves of leather-bound tomes lined the walls, a large oak desk stood near the window, and the faint smell of parchment and ink hung in the air. The candle burned, its flame unwavering despite the absence of wax at its base, casting a soft, unwavering light across the polished surfaces. Holmes moved with deliberate care, his gaze sweeping over the floor, the furniture, and the scattered manuscripts. "The absence of disruption is remarkable," he observed. "No footprints beyond those of the household. No indication of struggle. The desk drawers are slightly ajar, as if recently accessed, yet nothing appears missing. Observe the papers, Watson, their edges are pristine, the ink unblurred. Yet one must ask, what could compel a man of learning to vanish so completely?" I moved toward the desk, noting a thin, almost imperceptible line of ash tracing a path across the surface. "Holmes, look here," I said, pointing. "The remnants of the candle wick. It appears to have been handled carefully, almost ritualistically." Holmes examined the trace without touching it. "Indeed, Watson. Our scholar was meticulous in every action. But notice the subtle indentation here, along the edge of the desk, and here on the windowsill. The pattern suggests a rapid, repeated movement, yet of what purpose I cannot yet determine. There is intelligence behind it, a deliberate, controlled series of gestures. Not panic, but calculation." He crouched briefly beside the floorboards, pressing a gloved finger against a patch of dust. "See, Watson? A single boot print, faint yet distinct. Only one, and its direction is toward the fireplace." I followed his gaze to the hearth. The grate was cold, and the logs had been moved aside recently. Holmes inserted a small tool into the ash, producing a narrow channel beneath the hearth. He gestured for me to lean closer. "It is possible, though I do not yet confirm it, that our absent scholar made use of a subterranean route or at least left traces suggesting one. The more mundane possibility is that he was removed posthumously, though I see no indication of that. The lantern may be our key. It is anomalous." Mrs. Beecham watched in fear, wringing her hands. "Sir, I beg of you, the lantern, it burns as if with its own life. Even the light itself feels unnatural. I cannot abide it." Holmes, for the first time in the evening, allowed a faint smile to crease his usually austere features. "Fear is often the companion of mystery, Mrs. Beecham. Yet we shall employ reason in place of dread. The light, however, will guide us literally and figuratively." He placed the lantern upon the desk, turning it slowly in his hands. The flame's unwavering glow cast long, quivering shadows against the walls, illuminating the spines of books, the brass fittings of the telescope by the window, and the intricate carvings on the desk itself. Holmes' eyes sparkled with the rare thrill that comes when one senses the first threads of a tangled web. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are inconsistencies here that the casual observer would miss. The alignment of these objects, the precise placement of the manuscripts, the pattern of the Ashich element conveys a message. It is a silent language, known only to Mr. Harrow, and we are the students tasked with deciphering it. I felt a chill run through me. The intellectual excitement was palpable, yet beneath it ran a thread of unease. The study, despite its outward serenity, seemed almost alive with hidden motion, as if the walls themselves harbored the scholar's lingering presence. Holmes stepped back, placing a finger upon the lantern. "This object, Watson, is more than a lamp. It is a signal, a safeguard, perhaps even a key. Its persistence defies ordinary explanation. We shall return to it. But first, we must consider all who might have had knowledge of Mr. Harrow's movements tonight, those who might have had motive or opportunity. The solution, as ever, lies in the intersection of intellect and circumstance." Mr. Fairfax nodded, swallowing his fear. "I beg of you, Mr. Holmes, find him." "My client? I fear for his very life." Holmes' eyes gleamed, a mixture of calculation and resolve. "Fear not, Mr. Fairfax. We shall uncover the truth, piece by piece. The night is young, but already the first fragments of its secret have been revealed. Tomorrow, we shall follow each trace, each anomaly, with patient precision. The lantern, the marks upon the desk, the faint imprint by the hearthrug will speak in their own time." As we departed the study and returned to the fog-choked streets of Bloomsbury, I felt the familiar thrill that accompanies the beginning of a case whose solution promises both intellectual delight and peril. Holmes, ever the enigma, walked ahead, silent save for the occasional muttered observation. I followed, chronicler and companion, my mind awhirl with speculation, uncertainty, and that ineffable sense that London herself held secrets yet untold. The lantern, burning endlessly, remained behind in that study a silent witness to events unseen. A beacon of mystery that would guide us through the shadows, step by meticulous step. And I knew, with the certainty that only comes from long experience, that the night had only just begun to reveal its secrets. The following morning dawned with a London sky of slate and silver, a persistent drizzle blurring the gas lamps and cobblestones, as though the city itself were reluctant to reveal its secrets. Holmes and I, accompanied by Mr. Fairfax, returned to Bloomsbury to resume our examination of Mr. Elias Harrow's study. The events of the previous night had left a certain unease upon us, though I confess it was tempered by the familiar exhilaration that accompanies the opening of a complex case. Holmes, as ever, seemed to thrive in the tension, his keen intellect sharpened by every nuance of the unknown. Upon our arrival, Mrs. Beauchamp greeted us with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The lantern, she informed us, had continued its inexorable glow throughout the night, casting an unwavering light upon the desk, and the house itself seemed to vibrate with a quiet, peculiar energy. Holmes accepted the lantern with the gravity of a man handling a rare and fragile artifact. He examined it from every angle, occasionally tapping it lightly and peering through the glass with magnifying lenses of his own design. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, "that the flame is remarkably steady. Note the absence of convection currents typical in ordinary candles. The air around it is undisturbed. There is no smoke, no wax drippings, no sign of combustion. In short, this lamp is, for all practical purposes, an anomaly. Yet it is a natural anomaly, not supernatural. It has been designed with precision and ingenuity, the product of a disciplined mind rather than of chance or sorcery." I could see the sharp delight in his eyes, a rare instance in which his fascination with mechanism overtook even his sardonic detachment. "And you believe Mr. Harrow left it behind intentionally, Holmes?" I asked, though the answer seemed self-evident. "Intentionally, Watson," he affirmed. "And therein lies the first thread of our mystery. He did not vanish carelessly. He left signals, subtle but deliberate, for those he trusted or perhaps for those whom he wished to test. Observe the ash pattern upon the desk. Note the alignment of the manuscripts, the minute scratches along the edges. Each element has meaning. Each is a cipher, a trace left for the discerning observer." Holmes moved from the lantern to the bookshelves, scanning titles and examining the spines with meticulous care. "Mr. Harrow's pursuits are eclectic yet disciplined," he observed. "Here we find volumes on cryptography, on the manipulation of light, on philosophical treatises concerning perception. And here, strangely enough, are several manuscripts concerning the study of nocturnal phenomena, fireflies, phosphorescence, and other luminous substances. The lantern may be a device rooted in chemistry or optics rather than in the mystical." Mrs. Beauchamp, shivering slightly, interrupted. "Sir, it is the way it burns, it frightens the servants, and the study, it feels alive, as if he lingers here still." Her voice was tremulous, and I understood her sentiment, though my own mind sought rational explanation rather than sentiment. Holmes turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Fear, Mrs. Beecham, is often the companion of those unaccustomed to study and observation. You must understand that nothing here is beyond reason. Yet your unease is not misplaced. There is, indeed, an extraordinary arrangement of objects and indications that speaks to a mind both brilliant and peculiar." We began a systematic examination of the room. Holmes first inspected the fireplace more closely, noting the faint impressions in the ash and the subtle displacement of bricks in the hearth. He tapped them lightly, listening to the hollow notes, and then examined the windowsill, where tiny scratches suggested repeated contact with some small object. I took careful notes, as Holmes often instructed, noting each detail for later reflection. Holmes then requested a full inventory of the study's visitors and household staff from Mr. Fairfax. "We must consider opportunity and knowledge," he said. Who knew of Mr. Harrow's routines? Who might be aware of his devices and habits? Even a trusted hand may act under pressure if motivated by fear or gain. Mr. Fairfax provided the names of the servants and other associates. "No one of ill intent is known, sir," he said earnestly. "Yet there are colleagues and rival scholars who have long envied Mr. Harrow's intellect. None are violent, but envy can take subtle, pernicious forms." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Ah, the human element, the most unpredictable factor of all. A device may be precise, a schedule predictable, but the mind of man is a variable always capable of introducing chaos." He paused, tapping his fingers against his chin. "And yet, as often as not, chaos has its own logic. One must merely discover its form." As we continued our scrutiny, I could not help but notice a subtle inconsistency that had escaped both Mr. Fairfax and Mrs. Beecham. The lantern's light fell upon a small brass-bound journal, partially hidden beneath a larger tome. Its cover was unremarkable, yet I sensed its significance. I drew it out carefully, and Holmes peered over my shoulder, his expression unchanging yet intensely focused. "Ah," he murmured. "A record of experiments, perhaps, or observations. Note the precision of handwriting, the meticulous diagrams. Mr. Harrow is methodical to an extreme." And here he traced a line with his finger along the margin of one page of cipher. Simple, yet ingenious. Only a few could decipher this notation, and only a mind like Mr. Harrow's could create it. "Watson, we are seeing the first indication that his disappearance was planned, or at least anticipated." I felt a thrill of apprehension and admiration. The case was evolving into something far more intricate than a mere missing person inquiry. Here was a man of intellect who had, whether through design or compulsion, left behind a trail that demanded interpretation. Holmes' mind was already weaving the disparate elements: the persistent lantern, the locked study, the faint marks in the ash, the hidden cipher, into a pattern that I could scarcely imagine but would follow with trust and fascination. Holmes then requested that we reconvene later in the day to interview the household staff individually. Beginning with the butler, a tall, thin man with a precise, almost military bearing. The interviews promised insight into the habits and character of Mr. Harrow, as well as any unnoticed disturbances in the days leading to his disappearance. Holmes emphasized the importance of observing not only what was said but the manner of its expression, the inflection, hesitation, and body language. He spoke of these as if revealing an art I had only glimpsed but never mastered. By mid-morning, the drizzle had ceased, leaving a pale sun struggling to pierce the foggy horizon. As we walked back to Baker Street, I could not help but dwell upon the peculiarity of the lantern itself. Its unwavering light, the very heart of this mystery, seemed almost to mock our attempts at rational explanation. Holmes, walking beside me in his customary silent stride, appeared lost in thought, his eyes occasionally narrowing as he considered some unspoken calculation. "Watson," he said at last, breaking the silence, "the case is not one of mere disappearance. There are layers here, signals, tests, perhaps traps. The lantern is but a beacon, a single point from which the entire pattern radiates. Our task is to follow it with patience, observation, and above all, deduction. We are 3 steps behind the mind that engineered this scenario, yet I have every confidence that, given time, we shall understand its architecture." I nodded, the familiar thrill mingling with apprehension. London, in its damp, foggy morning, seemed at once comforting and mysterious, a city alive with secrets. and I, faithful chronicler and companion, felt the electric anticipation of the unfolding mystery, the intricate, deliberate puzzle that Mr. Harrow had left behind, and which Holmes was now prepared to unravel with that singular brilliance of mind for which he was famed. The first threads of suspicion had been drawn, subtle as spider silk yet strong enough to hint at the vast web of intrigue awaiting us. The lantern never dimmed, and in its steady glow lay the promise of revelation and danger. By the following afternoon, the case of Mr. Elias Harrow's disappearance had begun to attract the attention of the local authorities, though Scotland Yard's involvement was of the perfunctory sort one might expect when confronted with circumstances that strained credulity. Inspector Lestrade had called, his manner brisk and impatient, though tinged with the professional respect he had long since developed for Holmes. Holmes, for his part, received him with polite neutrality, gesturing toward the lantern as if to emphasize that ordinary procedures could scarcely illuminate the extraordinary. "You see, Lestrade," he said, "this is no common abduction or flight of a scholar. There are signals, ciphers, and devices that speak to intellect and calculation far beyond what your constables are accustomed to encountering." Lestrade, unconvinced but unwilling to offend, merely grunted. "Very well, Holmes, but someone must answer for this disappearance. If Harrow has been taken, I intend to find the culprit." Holmes allowed the inspector his moment of confidence before returning to our task. "Indeed. And that is precisely why the investigation must begin with those who had opportunity, knowledge, and, dare I say, motive." It was at this juncture that a new figure entered the scene. Mr. Leonard Quince, a fellow scholar, and, as I learned from Fairfax, a long-time rival of Mr. Harrow. Quince was a man of slender build, pallid complexion, and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling mixture of curiosity and calculation. His presence carried an air of both politeness and tension, as though every step and word were carefully measured. "I trust I am not intruding?" he said smoothly, addressing Holmes directly. "I have long admired Mr. Harrow's work, though I confess I have found our disagreements stimulating." Holmes studied him with his customary intensity. "We welcome all who may assist in clarifying the circumstances, Mr. Quince. Pray, tell us your knowledge of Mr. Harrow's habits, especially in the days leading to his disappearance." Quince shifted uneasily. "Harrow, he was absorbed as always in his studies, but there were moments when he confided in me regarding certain discoveries. He possessed a lantern, which he claimed could guide one through darkness beyond the ordinary. I confess I dismissed it as eccentricity. Yet I hear it burn still, and that is most extraordinary." Holmes inclined his head. "Eccentricity is a form of genius, or its near neighbor. Yet tell me, Mr. Quince, were there any recent disagreements between you and Mr. Harrow?" Quince's eyes narrowed fractionally, though he masked it quickly. "Disagreements? Only the usual scholarly debates over methodology and interpretation, hardly the sort to provoke mischief of this nature." Holmes' gaze, piercing and relentless, lingered on him. Yet human nature is rarely confined to polite discourse. One must consider envy, fear, ambition, even desperation. All are potent forces, capable of prompting acts most extraordinary. Now, given that Mr. Harrow has vanished, all must be considered, Mr. Quince. Quince swallowed and murmured something about the futility of speculation without evidence. Holmes allowed the moment to hang, a subtle but unmistakable test. Then he turned, walking slowly toward the hearth, inspecting the minute scratches and the faint boot print that had been noted previously. "Observe, Watson," he said, "that there is no additional footprint near the hearth. The intruder, if one exists, left in a manner not immediately apparent. Yet consider. Mr. Quince's knowledge of the lantern and his recent disagreements with Harrow place him, as we might say, within the circle of interest." I glanced at Quince. There was nothing overt in his manner, no tremor of fear, no overt attempt at concealment, yet I could not shake the subtle unease I felt in his presence. Holmes, of course, remained inscrutable, a mask of detached observation concealing the workings of his extraordinary intellect. We spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting a thorough examination of Harrow's study with Quince present. He offered several insights into Harrow's habits, including the placement of manuscripts, the use of the desk, and the peculiar nocturnal routines he had observed. Yet all the while Holmes listened quietly, nodding or making brief observations, as though absorbing far more than he revealed. When Quince departed, Holmes turned to Fairfax and myself. "A curious character, Watson," he remarked softly. He is both an admirer and a rival, constrained by etiquette yet aware of opportunity. He provides a useful distraction, a plausible suspect to occupy the minds of Scotland Yard and casual observers. Yet I caution you, appearances are often deceptive. We must not be so easily misled by a single thread. Despite Holmes' warning, I could not help but feel that the investigation had found a tangible focus. Quince's knowledge of the lantern combined with his rivalry made him a logical suspect. Lestrade, I noted, seemed pleased at the apparent progress, though Holmes' expression suggested that he considered the matter far from resolved. Holmes spent the remainder of the day examining the lantern and the hidden journal we had discovered the previous afternoon. He made precise measurements, jotted observations in his small notebook, and murmured occasionally about chemical compounds and optical devices. I could only follow at a distance, recording details as faithfully as I could, while marveling at his capacity to synthesize information invisible to ordinary minds. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes spoke little. His eyes, however, shone with the intensity of a man immersed in thought. "Watson, the case is more complex than even Mr. Harrow's own careful arrangements might suggest. We have a suspect, yes, and a plausible motive, but the true solution lies not in what is obvious but in what is concealed. The lantern, the journal, the scratches, each is a piece of the puzzle, and there are pieces we have yet to discover." I reflected on the events of the day. Mr. Quince, with his polite demeanor and concealed tension, had provided a focal point for suspicion. Yet there was an unease in me, a sense that the true intricacy of Harrow's disappearance had not yet been revealed. Holmes, as always, saw more than I could. I sensed that beneath his calm exterior, calculations were proceeding at a furious pace. As we sat by the fire in 221B, Holmes allowed himself a rare indulgence, the playing of his violin. The music filled the room, mingling with the smell of coal smoke and the faint chill that always seemed to linger despite the fire. I observed him in silence, noting the meticulous care with which he drew each note, as though the music itself were a form of reasoning, a way to align thoughts that could not otherwise be expressed in words. Suddenly he stopped and set the bow aside. "Watson," he said, his tone deliberate, "we have encountered the first misdirection. Quince is a convenient figure, easy for Lestrade to seize upon, yet the true path lies elsewhere. Note carefully the details we have gathered. The lantern, the ash, the subtle indentation on the hearth, the journal. The solution will emerge when we connect these elements. Quince is a shadow, Watson, a convenient obscuration." I nodded, though my own curiosity and apprehension were keen. The investigation had taken its first tangible step, yet it was clear that the true complexity of Mr. Harrow's disappearance had only begun to reveal itself. The lantern burned endlessly, the journal lay open with its cryptic notations, and Holmes, as ever, moved 3 steps ahead in a world of shadows, calculation, and intellect. London itself seemed to hold its breath that night, as though aware that a mystery of unusual subtlety was unfolding in the quiet streets of Bloomsbury. And in the distance, hidden behind the ordinary bustle, the first threads of deception were beginning to weave themselves, promising that the path to truth would be as labyrinthine as it was illuminating. The following morning arrived gray and damp, with a drizzle that clung persistently to the cobblestones and the fog drifting like a restless spirit between the buildings of Bloomsbury. Holmes, as usual, was already seated in his armchair when I descended the stairs of 221B. His gaze was fixed upon the small laboratory of chemical apparatus he had assembled in the corner of our sitting room, and the brass lantern from Mr. Harrow's study sat upon a side table, gleaming as if it were aware of our scrutiny. "Watson," he said without preamble, "I have remained awake most of the night considering the peculiarities of our case. The more one examines the visible details, the more insistent becomes the impression that a hidden message is embedded within them. A single subtle clue has been overlooked, and once discovered, it will illuminate the entire affair." I took my seat opposite him, my mind alert, though I was aware of the vast difference between his capacity for deduction and my own. Holmes, without waiting for my questions, picked up the lantern and examined it from multiple angles, rotating it slowly as though it were a globe of opaque truth. "Notice, Watson," he said at last, "the way the flame is skewed ever so slightly toward the right. It is imperceptible to ordinary observers, yet it is deliberate. The wick, though appearing spent, has been treated with a substance that maintains combustion through chemical reaction alone. That is remarkable, but not the crux. Observe also the placement of this journal." He gestured toward the brass-bound notebook we had discovered in Harrow's study. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. Holmes traced a line along the edge of the journal, then tapped it lightly with his gloved finger. The indentation here is minuscule, yet significant. Mr. Harrow has used this position to encode a message. Observe the spacing of the lines, the subtle press of the pen, the imperceptible differences in margin width. It is a cipher, Watson, though not one that can be resolved by ordinary eyes. I peered closely at the journal, tracing the faint impressions in the paper. I could detect the slight pressure of the pen, yet the meaning eluded me. Holmes, however, seemed to read it effortlessly, his eyes glimmering with the rare thrill of discovery. "Here," he said, pointing to a pattern of dots and dashes impressed in the margin, "we have a classic substitution cipher, combined with a positional key. The significance lies not merely in the letters represented, but in the sequence dictated by the indentation of the lines. A casual observer would dismiss these as accidental, yet the precision is undeniable. Mr. Harrow is guiding us towards something crucial." Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. "And here, Watson, is the crucial inconsistency that has escaped the police and the casual observer alike. Note the alignment of the manuscripts upon the desk, particularly this sequence of nocturnal studies and chemical treatises. The sequence is not random. It reflects the order in which Mr. Harrow expected events to unfold, or perhaps the method by which he anticipated being observed. The police and Mr. Quince are fixated upon outward appearances, yet the true message lies in the deliberate arrangement of objects, the very structure of his study." I tried to follow, but Holmes' rapid deductions always raced ahead of my comprehension. "So, he left a message," I said slowly, "embedded in the arrangement of the room itself." "Precisely, Watson. But not for us directly. For those he trusted or wished to challenge. The inconsistencies in Quince's story, the persistence of the lantern's flame, the peculiar scratches upon the hearth, all of these are signals. The cipher, once decoded, will indicate not only the direction he went but the reason for his disappearance. And the method is subtle, so subtle that only the most astute observer could perceive it. We spent the better part of the morning decoding the marginal cipher, Holmes demonstrating his mastery of substitution codes, positional keys, and letter spacing. Slowly, the hidden pattern began to reveal itself. References to locations in London, cryptic annotations about chemical compounds, and repeated indications of the lantern's function as a guide. It was painstaking work, yet with each revelation, the scope of Harrow's ingenuity became more evident. Finally, Holmes leaned back, a faint smile crossing his usually austere features. "We have it, Watson. The first real clue. The cipher points toward a location in the East End, an abandoned warehouse near the river, previously used by obscure chemists and lamp makers. Harrow may have chosen it for its isolation, its connection to luminous substances, or for some entirely unforeseen purpose, but it is certain that he intended to be found, provided one could follow the instructions embedded within his arrangements." I felt a thrill of anticipation tempered by unease. The case had transformed from a simple disappearance into a layered, intricate puzzle, and Holmes' calm precision revealed the true depth of Harrow's foresight. Yet there remained the human element, which, as Holmes often reminded me, was far less predictable than any cipher or mechanical device. Holmes' attention then returned to the lantern. "It is the linchpin, Watson. Its persistent flame not only serves as a guide but also as a signal. The exact chemical composition may indicate something about the location or even the method by which Harrow anticipated his observer's response. We must test it carefully, in situ, to determine whether it is merely an illuminating device or a key to further discovery." Before we could leave for the East End, Holmes insisted upon additional interviews with the household staff. Their observations, trivial as they might appear, could contain subtle details overlooked in our initial inquiries, details that would either confirm or contradict our emerging theory. One by one we spoke with the maid, the cook, and the night watchman, noting variations in the timing of lights, sounds in the study, and the unusual steadiness of the lantern's glow. Holmes, as ever, remained inscrutable, jotting observations in a small notebook with rapid, precise strokes. "Each element, Watson," he remarked, "is a vector toward the solution. There are false leads, of course, introduced both deliberately and by circumstance. But the hidden clue, the cipher in the journal, the arrangement of the desk, the persistent lanternies the thread that will unravel the entire web. And it is only by following it methodically, with patience and attention, that we shall arrive at the truth. As we prepared to depart for the East End, I felt a mixture of excitement and foreboding. The first hidden clue had been discovered, yet it was only a fragment of the greater design. Harrow's disappearance was no mere flight, it was a challenge, a test, perhaps even a warning. And Holmes, with that singular combination of intellect and intuition, was already 3 steps ahead, perceiving patterns invisible to all but the most discerning eye. The fog of London pressed against the windows of 221B as we stepped into the street. The lantern, carefully packed for transport, gleamed like a steadfast eye, illuminating the shadows that had long concealed the truth. And I knew, with that mixture of awe and apprehension that always accompanies Holmes' triumphs, that the path ahead would be as intricate as the mind of the man we sought to find. The streets of London were unusually silent that evening, the fog so thick that one could scarcely discern the flicker of gas lamps from a few yards away. Holmes, Fairfax, and I had made our way toward the East End, guided by the cipher and the subtle instructions we had painstakingly deciphered from Mr. Harrow's journal. The brass lantern, wrapped carefully in a protective cloth, sat securely beside Holmes on the handsome cab seat, its flame though concealed seemingly impervious to extinction. I could not help but feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation, for the cipher had suggested that the final piece of the puzzle might be encountered at a location of both isolation and potential danger. Holmes was unusually silent on the journey, his eyes constantly scanning the mist, as though perceiving patterns in the damp streets invisible to ordinary men. His fingers drummed lightly upon the hansome's leather edge, a subtle rhythm that I knew from long experience was the outward sign of his thoughts and motion. Fairfax, seated stiffly opposite, seemed ill at ease, glancing repeatedly at the surrounding fog and muttering occasionally about the dilapidated warehouses and shadowy figures that seemed to flicker in the periphery of vision. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered, leaning forward, "that the alignment of the buildings along this route coincides with certain cardinal directions indicated in Harrow's journal. It is subtle, but deliberate. The East End, as you know, contains more than its share of misdirection, and illicit commerce. Our scholar has chosen wisely. He anticipates our arrival, and perhaps the arrival of others less scrupulous than ourselves." I nodded, though unease crept into my thoughts. The East End at this hour is a place of uncertainty even on ordinary nights, and to pursue a hidden path guided by cryptic instructions into abandoned warehouses was to court peril. Yet Holmes moved with confidence, as though the shadows themselves parted to make way for his intellect. We disembarked near a narrow canal flanked by warehouses of brick and timber, some abandoned, others dimly lit by flickering lanterns in upper windows. The cipher had led us here precisely, and Holmes immediately began examining the surroundings. He crouched beside the dock, noting small scratches along the timber, subtle indentations in the mud, and faint traces of phosphorescent residue that glimmered in the gaslight. "Curious," he murmured. Watson, Fairfax, looked closely. "This residue, hardly visible, corresponds to the properties described in Harrow's manuscripts on luminescent substances. He has left a trail, faint though it is, that only the observant eye can follow." We proceeded cautiously along the canal, following the barely perceptible traces. The fog thickened, and the water lay black and still beside us, reflecting the occasional glimmer of a distant gas lamp. It was then that Holmes halted abruptly, holding up a hand. "Watson, Fairfax, we are not alone." From a shadowed doorway of a nearby warehouse emerged a figure tall, cloaked, and moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to stealth. The man paused briefly, as though measuring us, and then retreated with astonishing speed into the darkness beyond. Holmes moved after him, his pace swift and silent. I followed, heart pounding, while Fairfax hesitated, muttering protests about the dangers of pursuing an unknown figure in such conditions. The chase led us through a labyrinth of alleys, broken timbers and rotting docks, the figure always staying just ahead, glancing backward to gauge our pursuit. Finally, the man entered a small abandoned warehouse, its windows shattered and the door hanging on a single hinge. Holmes paused outside, crouching low to examine the threshold. "Note, Watson," he said softly, "that there are no footprints approaching the building other than those we have left. The figure has used a concealed entry, perhaps a side door hidden by the debris, and he is likely waiting for us inside." We entered cautiously. The interior was dim, though the faint phosphorescent glow on the floor and walls illuminated a narrow path. Then, with startling suddenness, the figure turned a man with a shocked expression, clutching a small bundle that glimmered faintly in the half-light. "Stop," Holmes commanded in a voice that brooked no hesitation. "Step forward and reveal yourself." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. I mean no harm," he stammered. "I only sought to recover what was lost. The master of the lantern, he entrusted me with it. I followed the trail, as best I could, to ensure it remained safe." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes piercing. "And who are you, sir? How did you come to be in possession of Mr. Harrow's effects?" The man introduced himself as Mr. Percival Dane, a colleague and apprentice of sorts to Mr. Harrow. He explained that Harrow had left instructions for him to safeguard certain documents and devices, including the mysterious lantern, in case of unforeseen circumstances. Dane's presence here, though seemingly fortuitous, introduced a complication. He had knowledge of Harrow's plans and the lantern's properties, but the exact nature of his involvement remained unclear. Holmes scrutinized him carefully. "You acted independently, Mr. Dane. You followed the instructions, yet altered nothing. Your purpose is protection, not interference." Dane nodded, his eyes steady. "Exactly, sir. I sought only to ensure that no harm came to the lantern or the manuscripts. I had no knowledge of his disappearance, only of the instructions he left in the cipher." Holmes studied him silently for several moments, then spoke. "Very well. Your presence clarifies one point. The disappearance was premeditated, and Mr. Harrow anticipated observers of keen intellect. Yet it also introduces another variable. Someone else may have followed this trail, with intent less honorable than yours." At that instant, a noise from the rear of the warehouse drew our attention. A door creaked open, and shadows flickered against the far wall. Holmes motioned for us to stay low. From the darkness emerged a second figure, masked and armed with a small implement that glinted faintly in the phosphorescent light. A struggle ensued, brief but intense. Holmes moved with astonishing speed, disarming the intruder and pinning him to the ground. The man struggled, but the effort was futile against Holmes' precision. I assisted in securing him, while Dane observed, visibly shaken. Holmes examined the captured intruder's clothing and equipment. "This confirms it, Watson," he said grimly. "Our missing scholar's disappearance is being exploited by parties whose intentions are far from innocent. We have the first tangible threat beyond mere misdirection, a man seeking to seize what Harrow has left behind. And the game, as we have observed before, has grown far more dangerous." The captured man, finally unmasked, revealed himself as a minor criminal known in the docks for petty thefts and occasional employment as a hired hand in more elaborate schemes. The details of his employer remained unclear, but Holmes' keen scrutiny suggested that the figure's presence was no mere coincidence. Someone was actively seeking Mr. Harrow's lantern and its associated knowledge, and the stakes had risen from mystery to peril. As we departed the warehouse and returned to the misty streets, the magnitude of the case became clearer. Harrow's disappearance was not merely an intellectual exercise or a self-imposed retreat, it was a prelude to conflict, a stage upon which hidden actors had begun to move. Holmes, silent but alert, carried the lantern carefully, and I followed with a sense of both awe and dread. The city seemed to close around us, fog curling in the alleyways like tendrils of some unseen presence. London had grown darker, not merely from the night or the mist, but from the unseen forces now entering the game, forces whose intentions remained obscure, but whose actions threatened to unravel the careful designs of a man who, as Holmes had said, never left a thread untied. The morning after our encounter at the dockside warehouse was damp and overcast, the fog pressing heavily against the windows of 221B. Holmes sat at the desk, the brass lantern carefully placed before him, and Percival Dane had joined us, his expression a mixture of deference and visible tension. The events of the previous night had brought the case into sharper focus, yet Holmes' mind was occupied not only with discovery, but with the deceptive intricacies that now presented themselves. "Watson," he began, turning to me with a glimmer of that sardonic curiosity he so often displayed when confronted with complexity, "we have now encountered the first obstacle beyond simple observation, the labyrinth of false trails. One must always remember that the human mind, when motivated by ambition, fear, or avarice, is quite capable of constructing elaborate diversions, and in this case, there are several at play simultaneously. I leaned forward, pen poised. You mean that the theft at the warehouse was merely a distraction? Precisely. The man we captured last night, though real enough in his presence, is not the architect of the scheme. He is a pawn, employed to test both our vigilance and our deductive skill. Observe, Watson, how many elements in this case have functioned similarly. The persistent lantern, the journal cipher, and even the placement of the manuscripts in the study. Each presents a solution that seems evident, yet each conceals additional layers. One must always pursue the thread beneath the thread. Percival Dane, who had been silent until this moment, leaned forward. Mr. Holmes, if I may, I believe you are right. I have heard rumors among my colleagues, faint whispers of Mr. Harrow's inventions, and some warnings about the significance of the lantern. But I admit that I cannot discern who might benefit from his disappearance or why. Holmes nodded slowly. The benefit lies not merely in possession of the lantern, but in control over the knowledge it embodies. A man of Harrow's intellect leaves more than mere objects. He leaves patterns, cues, and sequences. Misinterpret one, and you pursue a phantom. Follow the pattern, and you approach the truth. We began a careful review of all evidence gathered to date. The cipher in the journal, the faint scratches upon the hearth and desk, the phosphorescent residue along the dockside trail, and the curious composition of the lantern itself. Holmes scrutinized each with his customary intensity, drawing diagrams and mapping sequences across several sheets of paper. Watson, notice here, he said, pointing to a series of notations, the order in which the chemical treatises were arranged in the study. One might assume randomness, yet this sequence is deliberate. It correlates to the principles Harrow applied in his experiments, principles concerning the behavior of luminous substances under controlled conditions. In short, he has left us instructions, if we are observant enough to recognize them. I followed his explanation closely, my mind gradually apprehending the precision underlying what had seemed chaotic. So each apparent clue, the scratches, the residual light, the arrangement of booksies, part of a larger system of guidance. Exactly, and therein lies the danger, Holmes replied. For a misstep along this guided path invites error. Consider Mr. Quince, Watson. He has been eager to appear helpful, yet his eagerness may be manipulated. He is aware of the rivalry with Harrow and naturally seeks advantage. Were he to encounter the clues directly, he might misinterpret them and reveal his own intentions in the process. Our reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a small bundle of letters. One, in particular, caught Holmes' attention, an unsigned note delivered anonymously to our residence, the handwriting neat and precise. He broke the seal and read silently for several moments, then glanced at us with an expression of mild curiosity tempered by alertness. Watson Dane, he said finally, we now have confirmation that others are aware of our investigation. This note contains instructions meant to mislead us, yet it also contains subtle truths. Observe. The letter references a location in Whitechapel, but the direction suggested is deliberately offset by several degrees. The information is accurate, yet only partially so, a classic technique of misdirection. Percival Dane looked alarmed. So someone is deliberately trying to confuse us? Holmes allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. Indeed. But observe also what is not said, the absence of specific mention of the lantern or the journal. These omissions are as significant as the text itself. The misdirection is designed to engage our attention while concealing the central truth. We spent the remainder of the day following the clues embedded in the warehouse and the journal, carefully testing each assertion, observing each anomaly, and tracing patterns of light, sound, and residue. Holmes moved with methodical precision, while Dane assisted under instruction, and I chronicled every detail. Each path we pursued seemed promising, yet often ended in minor frustration, confirming Holmes' assertion that the labyrinth of false trails was now fully engaged. By evening, the intensity of the fog and the dampness of the streets had grown oppressive. Holmes paused on a bridge overlooking the canal, the lantern safely stored beneath his coat. Watson, the misdirection is now complete. Those who seek to control the outcome have acted cleverly, but not perfectly. There are contradictions, subtle yet revealing, that allow us to distinguish fact from deception. Our task is to remain vigilant, observant, and patient. I felt a chill, both from the fog and from the implications of Holmes' words. The case, which had begun as the curious disappearance of a scholar, was now a web in which rival minds, cunning criminals, and the scholar's own intricate designs were intertwined. Each revelation seemed to lead to further questions, each answer opening new avenues of investigation. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes remained unusually silent, his mind clearly occupied. I reflected on the day's events, the attempted theft, the hidden residue, the false leads, and the anonymous Letrand felt the familiar mixture of awe and apprehension that always accompanies work with Holmes. "Tomorrow," Holmes said softly, "we shall begin to disentangle the threads further. The misdirection has been established. The puzzle is in place. Now we must carefully test each element against observation and reason. Only then shall we approach the truth of Mr. Harrow's disappearance." I retired that night with a sense of foreboding and anticipation. London's fog seemed thicker than usual, pressing against the windows of our lodgings and curling into the corners of the room. The lantern, a steadfast symbol of illumination and mystery, remained in Holmes' care, its flame imperceptibly unwavering. And I knew, with the certainty born of many cases, that the next phase would bring both revelation and peril. The labyrinth of false trails had ensnared the unwary. But Holmes, ever the master of deduction, was already untangling the threads, perceiving the order hidden beneath apparent chaos. And I, faithful chronicler and companion, awaited the moment when the shadows would begin to yield their secrets. The following morning brought with it a brittle clarity, the fog of London receding just enough to allow the gas lamps to glow with full authority against the dampened streets. Yet the chill in the air was a reminder that the case of Mr. Harrow's disappearance had taken a decidedly darker turn. Holmes, as I entered 221B, was already at his desk, his hands deftly arranging small slips of paper and diagrams, his brow furrowed in concentration that betrayed the extraordinary workings of his mind. "Watson," he said without turning, "today we advance beyond observation into strategy. We are no longer merely following the traces left by Harrow and his adversaries. We must compel the actors to reveal themselves through their own designs. The stage is set. The players are in position, and the lantern, our constant guide, provides the illumination we require." I took my usual seat, aware that Holmes' plans were invariably precise yet veiled. "You intend, then, to draw out the true conspirators?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Observation alone will take us only so far. To understand the full scope, we must create conditions under which deception cannot persist. False leads will falter, and truth will be revealed by behavior. In short, we must become both the hunters and the observers, Watson." Percival Dane, who had remained with us since the dockside encounter, looked uneasy. "You mean to set a trap? That seems dangerous." Holmes gave a brief smile, more sardonic than reassuring. "Dangerous, yes, but controlled. We are guided not by recklessness but by calculated measures. Observe, Watson. The previous intruder at the warehouse acted predictably. He was a pawn. Those who would benefit from Harrow's disappearance are now compelled to act in order to secure their objective. By creating a scenario that appears advantageous to them, we can provoke a revealing step. We spent the morning preparing our plan. Holmes selected an abandoned warehouse near the Thames, previously used by minor chemists, much like the one where we encountered the first intruder. It was isolated, yet visible enough from strategic vantage points to allow careful observation. Inside, we placed a replication of the lantern, accompanied by documents designed to appear authentic but containing deliberate inconsistencies. "The key," Holmes explained, "is to make the location seem both vulnerable and valuable. The intruders, motivated by ambition or curiosity, will attempt access. In doing so, they reveal their methods, their knowledge, and ultimately their identities. We shall not interfere directly, except as circumstances demand. Patience and concealment are our tools." I observed, as Holmes meticulously arranged each element, the lantern's precise placement, the positioning of documents to suggest vulnerability, and even subtle traces of residue along the floor to mimic Harrow's prior methods. He had transformed the warehouse into a carefully orchestrated stage, and we were both actors and spectators in the impending drama. Percival Dane voiced his concern again. "And if something goes wrong? If they confront us?" Holmes' eyes glittered. "Then we adjust. We anticipate. and we react according to probability rather than impulse. That is the principle. Dane. Those who act without understanding the structure of the stage reveal their purpose. Those who act with understanding are, fortunately, rare, and we are well prepared for even that contingency. By mid-afternoon all preparations were complete. We took positions at concealed vantage points surrounding the warehouse, Dane stationed with us as both assistant and witness. Holmes observed the surroundings with the intensity of a hawk, noting even the faintest movement in the fog-drenched streets. Hours passed with little event, the city's murmur of distant carts and the occasional call of a watchman filling the silence. And then, at the hour when shadows deepened and the lamps flickered, the first figure appeared. A man moved cautiously through the fog, his gait measured, his hands covered in gloves that betrayed deliberate care. He paused at the edge of the warehouse, peering into the dim interior. Holmes whispered, "Observe, Watson." The intruder is methodical, aware of risk, yet unaware of our full preparation. Note the hesitancy in his step. He expects resistance, yet underestimates the degree of our observation. The man approached the door, testing the handle, then moved to a side window, clearly seeking entry. Holmes leaned forward, whispering instructions. Patience. Allow him to reveal his intent fully. Minutes passed. The intruder finally entered the warehouse, moving with quiet precision toward the lantern and documents. It was a moment of taut anticipation, the silence of the foggy evening amplified by the suppressed sound of our own breathing. Holmes' hand rested lightly upon a small revolver, though his expression remained calm, almost detached. The intruder's actions confirmed Holmes' hypothesis. He examined the documents, then the lantern, and began to take notes, unaware that his movements were being observed. Holmes, whispering to Dane and myself, outlined the significance of each gesture. The way the intruder's fingers lingered on certain papers, the particular angle at which he inspected the lantern, the subtle hesitation before attempting to remove it. Each movement was a revelation of intent and understanding. Suddenly, Holmes gave a barely perceptible signal, and we moved in. The intruder, startled, attempted to flee, but we were already positioned to block every exit. Within moments, he was apprehended, disarmed, and secured. Holmes examined him carefully, noting his attire, mannerisms, and the faint traces of residue on his gloves, chemical compounds consistent with those described in Harrow's manuscripts. "He is neither simple nor unskilled," Holmes remarked. "Observe Watson. He understands the value of the lantern and the associated documents. He is clearly employed by a party knowledgeable about Harrow's work, yet he lacks the insight to interpret the subtle misdirections we have placed. This confirms our hypothesis. Someone seeks control but without comprehension. We shall trace him, and in doing so, uncover those who orchestrate this scheme." Dane, visibly relieved but still uneasy, looked from Holmes to the captured intruder. "And the scholar? Mr. Harrow?" Holmes allowed a faint smile, inscrutable as ever. "He remains, as we have suspected, at a distance of his own choosing. Our task is to untangle the web surrounding him, to expose the actors who would manipulate events in his absence, and to preserve the integrity of his intentions. The lantern has guided us this far. It will continue to do so, provided we remain vigilant." As we returned to Baker Street, the evening fog pressing against our coats and hats, I reflected upon the extraordinary precision of Holmes' design. He had set the stage, controlled the variables, and compelled the adversary to act according to predictable patterns. Yet the larger mystery remained intact, the threads of Harrow's disappearance still veiled in subtlety. The night deepened, and the lantern, carefully transported back to 221B, glimmered faintly as if pleased with our progress. Holmes, seated once more at his desk, began to outline the next steps. Interrogating the captured intruder, tracing his connections, and above all, analyzing every subtle indication of Harrow's premeditated signals. I realized, as I prepared my notes, that the case had now entered its most intricate phase. The misdirection had been tested, the trap set, and the first revealing step had been taken. Yet the true revelation, the connection between Harrow, his lantern, and the shadowy forces now at work remained just beyond reach, awaiting Holmes' extraordinary skill to illuminate it fully. And so, as London's gas lamps flickered through the thinning fog, I understood that we were on the cusp of discovery. Though the labyrinth of deception and ingenuity was far from exhausted, Holmes, calm yet intensely alert, was already planning the next stage, ever 3 steps ahead, as the city around us held its breath in anticipation. The morning that followed our capture of the intruder was unusually crisp, with a sun attempting to pierce the lingering fog over London. Holmes, as always, was already awake, seated in his armchair, the brass lantern resting beside him. And the captured man, who had proven more articulate than we had anticipated, awaited questioning in a corner of our sitting room. I, of course, took my place with pen and notebook, prepared to chronicle what would likely become the most intricate deduction I had ever witnessed. Holmes' eyes flicked toward me. "Watson, the time has come to assemble the scattered threads. Each clue, each deception, each subtle variation in behavior contributes to a single pattern. What appears chaotic, when properly observed, is in fact highly ordered. And it is my task to reconstruct the design hidden beneath superficial disorder." I nodded, my heart quickening. We had pursued ciphers, observed intruders, and navigated misdirections, yet the full scope of Mr. Harrow's disappearance and the stakes involved remained obscured. Holmes, however, seemed to operate on a plane of comprehension that left ordinary men, myself included, in a state of awe. He began by interrogating the intruder, whose name, as we had learned, was Jonathan Pritchard. The man, once intimidated by Holmes' penetrating gaze, became increasingly cooperative, revealing a network of individuals who had sought to acquire Harrow's lantern and manuscripts for purposes both ambitious and unscrupulous. Pritchard was employed not by a singular master, but by a consortium of scholars and entrepreneurs, each eager to exploit the discoveries encoded in Harrow's work. Holmes listened in silence, occasionally interjecting with precise questions, until the narrative became coherent. "So," Holmes said at last, "you were tasked with recovering the lantern and ensuring that the instructions could not be followed by others. Yet you acted independently of knowledge concerning Mr. Harrow's location." Pritchard nodded. "Yes, sir. We knew only that the lantern was important, but none of us had access to the cipher or the reasoning underlying its placement." Holmes' fingers drummed lightly on the table. "And yet you failed to interpret the subtleties in Harrow's arrangements, the signals designed for the observant mind. In attempting to secure what you did not understand, you revealed your employer's intentions through your own actions. That, Mr. Pritchard, is why you have been caught." Once Pritchard had been secured and would remain in custody for further questioning, Holmes turned to Dane and me. "Now, Watson, Dane, I shall reveal the true structure of the case, the pattern that has been guiding us since the discovery of Harrow's disappearance. Pay close attention, for the logic is both elegant and precise." Holmes began by outlining the sequence of events, beginning with the peculiar persistence of the lantern's flame, the subtle ciphers embedded in the journal, and the arrangement of Harrow's manuscripts. Each element, he explained, was intended to guide a careful observer toward an understanding of the scholar's intentions while simultaneously misleading those motivated solely by ambition or rivalry. "Observe, for instance," he continued, "the placement of manuscripts A, B, and C. To the untrained eye, they appear arbitrary. Yet their sequence corresponds to the steps necessary for producing the luminescent substance in the lantern. Simultaneously, the margins and indentations in the journal provide directions to a safe location in East End warehouse that serves as a temporary repository, but which is designed to attract the attention of those who would exploit it improperly." I followed, astonished by the level of foresight. "So the warehouse, the lantern, even the intruder's actions were all anticipated by Harrow." "Precisely, Watson. And note the elegance of the design. Harrow predicted not only the behavior of strangers but also the subtle duplicity of those closest to him. Mr. Quince, for instance, with his rivalry and familiarity, was positioned as a natural suspect. His eagerness to appear helpful made him vulnerable to suspicion without compromising the scholar's broader strategy. Each player acted according to character, and the scholar's arrangement accounted for it." Holmes then displayed a map of London marking the locations referenced in the cipher. The lines connecting the points revealed not only physical routes but also logical pathways, routes of observation and influence, leading inexorably toward the final revelation. "The true purpose of the lantern, Watson, is not merely illumination," he said, "but signal, guidance, and test. Its flame burns not to provide light to the casual observer, but to mark the path to comprehension, the path to understanding Harrow's intentions." He paused, eyes gleaming with intensity. The final misdirection, however, lay in the assumption that Harrow had vanished unwillingly. In truth, he orchestrated his absence, choosing seclusion to observe the reactions of those around him. He sought to determine who could understand the implications of his work, who would be corrupted by ambition, and who would act with foresight and discretion. I leaned forward, breathless. "And the intruder we captured last night, merely a test," Holmes replied. "A step in the sequence that reveals the actors behind the scenes." By following the trail and attempting to interfere, Pritchard exposed the intentions and limitations of his employers. They remain, of course, at large, but their methods are now predictable. And when Harrow emerges, as he surely will, the full resolution will be evident. Holmes then turned to the lantern itself. Its flame flickered faintly, steady and unwavering, reflecting the complexity of the scholar's design. "Watson, observe carefully. The lantern is more than a device. It is a symbol, a guide, and an instrument of revelation. Its endurance mirrors the intellect and foresight of its creator. And it is only by attending to such details, by observing both the explicit and the implicit, that one attains understanding." Finally, Holmes recounted the interplay of deception and truth, demonstrating how each false lead, the anonymous letter, the warehouse intrusion, the rival quince, had been woven deliberately to test the acumen of observers. The cumulative effect, he explained, was to separate the careless from the perceptive, the ambitious from the ethical. As he concluded, I felt the full weight of the scholar's ingenuity, combined with Holmes' extraordinary ability to perceive and reconstruct the hidden architecture of events. The mystery of Mr. Harrow's disappearance was no longer merely a question of location, but a testament to foresight, intelligence, and moral discernment. Holmes allowed the moment of revelation to linger, then set his hands upon the lantern. "And now, Watson, we await the scholar's own emergence. Those who sought to exploit him have revealed themselves, guided unwittingly by the very devices they hope to control. The stage is prepared for final resolution, and the lantern burns as it always has, steadfast, illuminating truth amid shadow. I, faithful chronicler and witness, could scarcely contain my admiration. The intricacy of the design, the interplay of misdirection and revelation, and the profound subtlety of human behavior, all observed and orchestrated with Holmes' unmatched intellect, left me in awe. The city outside, with its fog and gas lamps, seemed to pause in reflection, as though aware that a hidden genius had choreographed an extraordinary sequence of events. And I realized, as Holmes sat in quiet triumph, that the true mystery had been as much an exploration of human character and intellect as it had been a question of a missing scholar. The web had been unraveled, yet the final threads, the scholar himself and the fate of those who had sought to exploit his work, remained poised for conclusion. The morning after Holmes' intricate exposition dawned clear but crisp, with a pale sun glinting off the wet streets of London. Yet the city's brightness contrasted sharply with the lingering tension that clung to 221B Baker Street. Holmes, seated with his customary poise, had the brass lantern beside him and a small pile of correspondence neatly arranged on the desk. I, as ever, was poised with pen and notebook, eager to document what I sensed would be the denouement of our intricate investigation. Percival Dane was also present, his demeanor a mixture of anticipation and respect, for he had witnessed firsthand the precision of Holmes' deductions and the subtle orchestration that had brought us to this moment. We had secured Pritchard, and the traces of the consortium seeking to exploit Mr. Harrow's work had been partially revealed. Yet the scholar himself remained unseen, his final intentions unknown. As the morning progressed, Holmes received a discreet message, delivered in the form of a sealed note, bearing the familiar handwriting of Mr. Harrow. Holmes read it quietly, then allowed a faint smile to cross his usually austere features. "Watson," he said softly, "it appears that our scholar has deemed the time appropriate to rejoin the world of the observant. He will arrive at Baker Street shortly, and I anticipate that his presence will bring clarity to all remaining ambiguities." I felt a thrill of anticipation. Mr. Harrow's ingenuity had guided us through ciphers, false leads, and even physical peril, and now we were to witness the resolution of his own orchestration. A knock at the door interrupted our reflection. Holmes opened it to reveal Mr. Harrow himself, walking with a quiet dignity, his eyes alight with intelligence and amusement. He carried a small satchel which I quickly realized contained additional documents and instruments. His gaze swept the room, assessing the arrangements as though he were confirming the efficacy of his own design. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Dane," he said, his voice measured but warm. "I see that my little test has proceeded precisely as anticipated. You have followed the threads, observed the signals, and discerned the patterns. I am most gratified." Holmes inclined his head, a rare expression of camaraderie softening his features. "And we are gratified to witness the outcome, Mr. Harrow. Your design was intricate, yet all elements aligned as reason and observation dictated." Harrow seated himself and began to explain the final elements of his disappearance. He described his premeditated retreat, the reason for the lantern's design, and the multiple contingencies embedded in the ciphers and arrangements. Each detail, he assured us, had been carefully considered to differentiate between those motivated by curiosity, intellect, and ambition, and those whose intentions were unscrupulous. "You see, gentlemen," Harrow explained, "the lantern was more than a mere source of illumination. Its persistent flame, chemically sustained, served as both beacon and guide. The cipher in the journal, the placement of manuscripts, and even the residual traces at the dockside were all deliberate signals intended for the observant mind. The world is replete with distractions, and true understanding often lies hidden beneath layers of apparent chaos." I listened with growing admiration, marveling at the scholar's foresight and the elegance of the design. Holmes, ever composed, occasionally interjected to clarify points, aligning the scholar's explanation with the deductions we had made over the past days. Percival Dane, who had assisted in the fieldwork and observed the unfolding events, spoke next, and the intruder, the consortium. "They were aware of the lantern but not of the underlying principles." Harrow nodded. "Exactly. They sought possession without comprehension. Observation without understanding yields only partial knowledge. It is, I suppose, a reflection on human nature. Some act out of curiosity, others out of ambition, and few act with the requisite discernment to grasp the subtle truth." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "And it is precisely that discernment, Mr. Harrow, which has guided us to this point. The intruder and his employers revealed themselves through their own actions, as we had anticipated. Observation and strategic placement, these are the instruments by which your intentions were safeguarded." Harrow retrieved a small envelope from his satchel and handed it to me. "For your chronicle, Dr. Watson. I trust you have recorded events faithfully, yet this provides clarification where subtlety may have obscured meaning. The interplay of misdirection, observation, and revelation is intricate, and I would not wish it to be misunderstood." I accepted the envelope, noting that it contained diagrams, marginalia, and annotations clarifying the chemical processes of the lantern, the exact interpretation of the cipher, and the reasoning behind each staged event. It was a scholar's supplement to a detective's chronicle, emerging of intellects in pursuit of truth. Holmes, after a contemplative pause, addressed Harrow directly. "And your final objective? Beyond the test of observation and intellect?" Harrow's eyes sparkled. "To determine the character of those around me, to observe who would act ethically, who would succumb to ambition, and who would misinterpret the signals for self-interest. The lantern and the ciphers were the instruments, but the human element, moral and intellectual, is the true measure." There was a silence profound in its weight. The city outside, with its fog dissipated by the morning sun, seemed irrelevant in comparison to the dense intellectual and moral tapestry woven within the room. Holmes leaned back, his hands folded, a rare expression of satisfaction upon his features, while I, pen poised, felt the significance of the scholar's return and the culmination of events. At last Harrow stood. "The intruder will be questioned further, and the consortium's intentions exposed. The lantern remains, not merely as an object, but as a testament to observation, patience, and insight. And now, my absence having served its purpose, I return to the ordinary world, where truth often hides in plain sight." Holmes nodded, his expression inscrutable yet approving. "You have conducted a remarkable test, Mr. Harrow. Observation, logic, and subtlety have guided us, and the result has affirmed the principles by which the world may be measured. I, for my part, felt a deep satisfaction in having chronicled the final act. The scholar's disappearance, the intruder's machinations, and the lantern's persistent glow, all were now resolved, the threads of misdirection unraveled, and the human and intellectual lessons laid bare. As we prepared to depart from Baker Street that afternoon, the lantern gleaming steadily in its brass casing, I reflected on the extraordinary events. London, with its fog, gas lamps, and labyrinthine streets, had provided the stage. Holmes, with his unparalleled intellect, had navigated the shadows of human ambition. And Mr. Harrow, with his foresight and ingenuity, had ensured that truth, observation, and integrity prevailed. The city seemed quieter somehow, as if it had exhaled in relief, leaving the glow of the lantern as a lasting symbol. A light unwavering amidst the shadows, a guide to those with eyes to see and minds to understand. And in that quiet reflection, I understood once more why I have chronicled the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, not merely for the thrill of mystery, but for the demonstration of intellect, insight, and the enduring triumph of reason and human discernment. The days following Mr. Harrow's return were suffused with a remarkable stillness, a calm after the storm of investigation and intrigue that had enveloped London's East End. Yet for those of us who had been intimately involved in the unraveling of the mystery, the scholar himself, Holmes, Percival Dane, and myself, the calm was more contemplative than restful. There were lingering matters to attend to, loose threads of human behavior to examine, and the intricate web of consequences to observe as events took their natural course. Holmes, as was customary, had returned to his laboratory of observation within 221B Baker Street. Carefully arranging his notes, the lantern still glowing faintly at his side. His methods of reflection were meticulous, almost ritualistic. The examination of minutiae, the comparison of observations, the cataloguing of cause and effect. I watched him for a moment, as he rearranged a set of chemical residues from the dockside warehouse with the precision of a man sorting chess pieces. The consequences, Watson, he remarked without looking up, are often more instructive than the immediate events. Observe Pritchard. Captured, questioned, and ultimately cooperative, yet his actions have revealed not only his character but that of his employers. One may study human behavior as a scientist studies chemical reactions. Predictable outcomes, contingent on variables such as ambition, fear, and moral discernment, can yield insights far beyond the initial scope. Percival Dane, who had been reviewing the documents delivered by Harrow, spoke quietly, almost reverently. And what of the consortium? Those who sought the lantern's secrets? Holmes allowed a faint smile. They are now under observation, and their methods known. The law will intervene where appropriate, but even more instructive is the manner in which they respond to thwarting and exposure. Some will retreat, humbled and cautious. Others will seek alternative strategies, revealing further traits. All are now exposed to the subtle influence of their own ambition, which is as illuminating as any lantern. Indeed, the authorities had begun their inquiries, guided subtly by Holmes' detailed observations and the confessions elicited from Pritchard. The consortium's network was partially dismantled, their schemes laid bare. Yet Holmes insisted that the moral lessons of the case were as significant as the legal resolution. I observed Dane carefully, noting the reflection in his eyes as he considered the scholar's methods and the consequences for those who had acted improperly. "It seems, Mr. Holmes," he said, "that Mr. Harrow's design was both a test and a lesson. Those who acted without understanding, without foresight, have exposed themselves to consequences that might otherwise have remained hidden." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And it is here, Watson, that the intellectual dimension intersects with the moral. Observation alone is insufficient. Comprehension and integrity are required to navigate complexity successfully. The lantern, the ciphers, the misdirections all serve as instruments of revelation. Those who understand reap insight, those who pursue ambition alone encounter peril." Mr. Harrow himself, now more comfortable in the familiar surroundings of Baker Street, spoke with the warmth of a scholar who has observed human nature at its most intricate. "I designed the sequence not merely to protect the lantern or my work, but to understand those who would encounter it. The disappearance was a test, yes, but also a study in human character. Those who acted impulsively or dishonestly revealed themselves without my intervention. Observation, deduction, and discernment, the principles you employ, Mr. Holmes, are precisely the virtues I sought to evaluate." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Your design was elegant, Mr. Harrow. It respected human nature while imposing a framework for discernment. It is, in many respects, a model of subtle pedagogy. One might learn as much from observing the failure to understand as from the comprehension itself." I, ever the chronicler, found myself reflecting on the profound nature of the events. The case had begun with the disappearance of a scholar, evolved through the intrusion of petty criminals and ambitious rivals, and culminated in the careful orchestration of observation and revelation. The interplay of intellect, morality, and foresight had transformed a seemingly straightforward mystery into a rich exploration of human character. Holmes turned to me, eyes piercing yet thoughtful. "Watson, you have observed closely, chronicled faithfully, and engaged with the reasoning process. It is often in the act of recording that one solidifies understanding. Note also the interplay of patience and anticipation. Many would rush to judgment. Few would perceive the deliberate signals left by Mr. Harrow. Few indeed." Dane, visibly moved, added, "It seems that even the errors, the misinterpretations, the intrusions were instructive. They revealed much about intention, character, and capability." Holmes allowed a moment of silence to settle upon us, the kind of quiet that always precedes reflection. "And so, the consequences of action and inaction are made manifest. Every decision, every hesitation, every ambition or oversight leaves a trail. The observant mind may discern it. The unobservant is left in darkness. The lantern is a metaphor, as much as it is a device. It illuminates not merely the physical, but the moral and intellectual landscape." Mr. Harrow, now rising to depart, addressed us with gentle warmth. I returned to my work, confident that those who have acted ethically and with insight are capable of safeguarding my intentions. Those who sought advantage without understanding are exposed to natural consequences. I leave the final unfolding to circumstance, but with reassurance that observation, intellect, and integrity have prevailed. As the scholar departed, leaving the lantern in Holmes' care, the atmosphere within Baker Street seemed charged with a sense of completion, yet tempered by reflection. The city outside, vibrant with life yet oblivious to the recent intellectual and moral contest, pressed against the windows with the normality of everyday existence. Yet within our rooms the lessons of human behavior, foresight, and observation lingered like a subtle but persistent fragrance. Holmes, finally reclining in his armchair, allowed a rare expression of satisfaction to grace his features. "Watson, Dane, we have witnessed the consequences in full measure. Observation, intellect, and integrity have proven their value. The misdirection has been revealed, the intruder subdued, and the scholar's design validated. Yet the true triumph is in understanding the moral and intellectual principles that underlie the events. That, ultimately, is the enduring illumination." I closed my notebook with a sense of fulfillment. The case of the lantern, the disappearance, the intruders, and the subtle orchestration of events had been resolved, yet it remained a testament to the delicate balance of intellect, foresight, and human character. London streets, gas lamps, and fog would continue their eternal rhythms, yet the lessons of observation and discernment, carefully chronicled, would endure in memory and record. And as Holmes, calm and contemplative, tended to the lantern, its persistent flame seemed to mirror the enduring light of reason and insight, the true triumph of the mind over the shadows of misdirection, ambition, and uncertainty. The weeks that followed the resolution of Mr. Harrow's disappearance brought a serene, almost reflective calm to Baker Street. London continued its ceaseless rhythm, the rattle of hansom cabs along cobbled streets, the faint hum of distant markets, and the perpetual fog that clung to the Thames edges. But within our rooms, a quiet sense of closure and satisfaction prevailed. The lantern, ever steadfast, glimmered softly on its brass stand beside Holmes' chair, a silent testament to the intellect and foresight that had guided us through a labyrinth of intrigue. Holmes, as usual, began the morning with meticulous care, examining letters, notes, and the subtle residue from previous cases, his mind never idle. I observed him from my seat, pen in hand, reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought us to this day. Percival Dane, now more composed, had returned to his own affairs, yet he occasionally visited, still animated by the memory of witnessing Holmes' methods in full operation. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, glancing toward me with that familiar gleam of calculation, "I find it most instructive to consider the final state of affairs, not merely the resolution of events. The study of consequences, motives, and moral disposition often yields insights beyond the immediate satisfaction of a solved mystery." I nodded, eager to engage in the reflective discourse. "It seems, Holmes, that Mr. Harrow's design was not merely a protective measure for his inventions, but also a profound study of human character." "Precisely," Holmes replied. Observe the intruder, Pritchard. His actions, though misguided, revealed the priorities, the ambitions, and the limitations of his employers. They acted without comprehension and thus, in revealing their methods, exposed themselves to natural consequence. Observation is not merely the passive act of seeing, Watson, it is the active discernment of intent and character. I considered the implications. And the consortium. Holmes allowed a faint, sardonic smile. They are now constrained by both circumstance and law, yet the more subtle consequence is intellectual. They have been illuminated by the failure to perceive, and by the triumph of foresight over ambition. Mr. Harrow's design was as much a moral exercise as it was a test of intellect. The lantern, in this context, is both literal and figurative, a light against the darkness of ignorance, misinterpretation, and unchecked desire. The lantern itself, its steady flame glimmering faintly in the corner, seemed almost to affirm Holmes' assertion. I could not help but marvel at the interplay of human ambition and intellect, at the extraordinary capacity for foresight, and at the elegance with which Holmes had untangled the web of deception. Mr. Harrow, who had now resumed a measure of ordinary life, visited us one afternoon. He brought with him a small collection of manuscripts and a refined demeanor, tempered by the experience of orchestrating his absence and observing the reactions it provoked. His eyes, always alight with intelligence, reflected both amusement and satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, settling comfortably in an armchair, "I am most grateful for your diligence and discernment. The test I devised has concluded successfully, and the lantern remains in the hands of those capable of appreciating its significance. Observation and comprehension have prevailed, and the moral lessons embedded in the sequence have been confirmed." Holmes inclined his head. "Your design was exemplary, Mr. Harrow. Each element, the misdirection, the ciphers, the staged intrusions, was aligned with the principles of observation and deduction. It has been a rare pleasure to navigate your labyrinth of intellect and foresight." Harrow's gaze met mine, and he spoke with measured warmth. "Dr. Watson, you have chronicled these events faithfully, capturing not only the actions but the subtle interactions of character and intellect. The narrative you preserve is as much a record of human nature as it is of the lantern and its associated designs." I felt a swell of pride, yet humility as well. To witness such orchestration of intellect, character, and moral insight was a privilege beyond mere documentation. It was a study in the potential of observation and reasoning to discern truth in the midst of deliberate confusion. Holmes, as if anticipating my thoughts, turned slightly and remarked, "It is instructive to consider the broader principle. Human behavior is a complex weave of intention, understanding, and error. The observant mind discerns patterns not only in overt actions but in subtle omissions, hesitations, and choices, and in such discernment lies both knowledge and wisdom." I reflected upon the sequence of events, the warehouse intrusion, the ciphered manuscripts, the anonymous letter, and the final emergence of Mr. Harrow. Each step had tested observation, patience, and reasoning, and each had confirmed the superiority of careful deduction over impulse, and insight over ambition. Holmes rose and approached the lantern, its soft glow illuminating his sharp features. "Watson, the case of the lantern that never dimmed is concluded, yet its lessons endure. Observation, patience, comprehension, and moral integrity, these are the true lights amid the shadows of uncertainty." And as always, the city outside continues, indifferent to the dramas of intellect, yet offering infinite opportunities for the careful observer. I made note of his words, aware that they were not merely a reflection on a single case but a philosophical summation of all our shared experience. The lantern's flame, steadfast and unwavering, seemed emblematic of the enduring power of reason and insight in a world prone to confusion and ambition. Mr. Harrow, rising to depart once more, offered a final thought. "Gentlemen, the lantern shall remain, a symbol of guidance for those capable of discernment. Let it remind us that truth is often concealed beneath layers of complexity, and that patience, integrity, and intellect are the means by which one may attain it." And with that, he left, the soft echo of his footsteps fading into the corridor. Holmes returned to his chair, eyes fixed upon the flame, contemplative yet satisfied. I, pen in hand, felt the weight and satisfaction of chronicling a case in which intellect, foresight, and moral discernment had prevailed over misdirection, ambition, and error. As night descended upon London, the gas lamps casting their gentle glow upon the streets, I understood fully why I had devoted myself to recording the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, not merely for the thrill of mystery, but for the illumination it offered, a testament to reason, observation, and the enduring light of human intellect. The lantern, steady in its glow, seemed to embody the lessons of the case. That even amid the shadows of uncertainty, careful observation, intellect, and moral clarity could illuminate the truth. And as Holmes reclined, calm and triumphant, I knew that the flame, much like his mind, would continue to shine ever bright, a guiding light in a world often shrouded in darkness. Thus concluded the extraordinary affair of the lantern that never dimmed, a case of intricate design, human ambition, and the triumph of intellect, which I had the honor to witness and chronicle.